Right, now let's take a closer look at some of the minor issues that we can fix, that we need to fix, that we want to fix to improve the overall integration of our smoke here with the rest of the plate. So let's take a look at what's happening with the render itself. So we can navigate back up to these little cubes or squarish shapes that come from the proxy geo, which was used as a holdout for the render. So obviously this is not perfectly matching our plate, which is expected. As you can see here, we have a little bit of a difference. And the way we're going to tackle this is by locally warping the areas where we have the occlusion happening here, and we're going to make sure that the edges of these blocky parts of the building are warped to match similar shapes that we see here in the plate, which are a little bit less perfect, more rounded in some areas. And we're going to use another node for this. And if you go into the gizmos that you brought in, we're going to use a node called Liquify. And for those of you who are familiar with Photoshop, it's pretty much a very similar type tool. You can paint on the image and use it as if it's a soft material. So we'll copy this node here, and we are going to go down here, and we'll paste it here. So we'll connect this to, so this is a gizmo that came from Nukepedia, same thing, created by Peter Tsonav. It's not somebody I know, but it's a very useful tool, and I thought I would include it in our recording here for this course. So how does this node work? Well, it takes two inputs, and when you connect it to the source, what you get is nothing much. You get something like that. You first need to click on setup, and once you do the setup, it will create additional nodes on the side. It creates a reformat node, which is set to the project resolution. Then it creates a UV map, and it also creates a roto paint node. Now this roto paint node is what we'll be acting upon in order to modify or warp our image here. We'll connect the output of this liquify node to the rest of the image, okay? And the idea here is to use some paint strokes to deform locally in very specific regions where we want the changes to happen. So we're going to go into the paint node, and instead of selecting a brush, we'll use a smudge tool, which is actually right here, the smear tool. You can see the finger. So if you press and hold, you can select the smear. And the next thing that you want to make sure of is that instead of single, we don't want to do several strokes per frame. We can go to a different frame and do other paint strokes. We just want to go to a frame where we see the issue, and we want to make sure that the strokes that we'll be painting will be active for all the frames, meaning they're not going to disappear if we change frames. And for that, we're going to change this to all, the build up all. And the hardness, we can keep this fairly low. It's actually 0.2, and that should be fine. And we can also reduce the brush size or increase it by pressing the Shift key on the keyboard and click and slide inside the viewer itself. To start brushing, it's doing it in a very hard manner. The default settings are pretty hard. So we want to make sure that the opacity is down a little bit. The hardness is 0. The opacity, we can go to like 0.2. And we're going to start gently bringing in the pixels so that we make them conform to the plate and essentially hiding. And we can do multiple strokes like that very gently until we no longer see the issue here. So when we warped the top of the image here, the smoke, to make sure that it interacts well with the existing structure in the building in a very localized manner, but the area or the frames on which I painted, obviously because the building is moving in space. So let's say if I'm painting a stroke at 1485 here, in this particular location here, right here, over time, well, that what happens inside of this area will change, which means that the warping that I'm doing needs to also be tracked along with the plate. So how do we do that? Right now we have paint strokes on a static image or static UV frame. how do we make that happen in uh, in a specific location that tracks over time, that moves over time? So what we can do, let's take a look again at the issue in the final render. What we can do is essentially have a bit of a garbage mat or a roto here, if you like, and we can track that shape, right? And make sure that it moves along with our plate, our building here. So let's take a look at the frames where the problems start to appear. Well, obviously the problem will start to appear when the smoke kind of goes over the area here, just around the the intersection. So that starts to happen at around frame 1460, something like that, 1461. So we can try to track the building. We do have some tracking data already, but I want to take this opportunity to show you another tracking method. This time we're going to be using a planar tracker. So here I'm going to create planar tracker, and this planar tracker is going to be connected to my plate. So I created a dot right here, further down, but I can also bring this further up if I wanted. I can connect this to any of the dots here, but let's just connect it to, actually let's connect it to this one. I am going to create a simple shape. So this shape, I can create a rectangle, for example, something that is encompassing this particular region of my tower here, or the building. Call it a tower, but it's a side of the building. Just going to put this somewhere like this. Okay, just tracking that particular side of the wall at that same distance away from camera. We're obviously not going to track something that's close to camera. We're going to track just the area of interest here. We created the frame of this particular planar tracker at frame 1461. So we'll track forward. As we track forward, this shape will follow the motion of the camera, the motion of the building, the position, the scale, etc. So we'll let that track for a minute or two. And when we come back, we'll be using this tracking information and we'll apply it to a shape. And that shape is going to be distorting the UV map in a very specific location. And it is that distortion which is going to be following the building, which is then going to distort the smoke that goes around the details at the top of the wall. So sounds a little bit complicated. Let's leave this running for a little bit, and we'll come back to it shortly. All right, our planar tracker has finished tracking, and we can see the result here from frame 1461 all the way to the end. We can see that our shape is accurately, precisely tracking the side of the building. So that's a good sign. That's exactly what we wanted to see happen. Now, the next thing that we want to do, we're going to go back to the same frame 1461, and we are going to click on the correct plane button here. It's the one right next to the grid here. We're going to show the lines here. So this shows us in 3D Space kind of what happens to this particular plane. That's why it's called planar tracker. We're tracking a particular flat surface, and we can see what the translation, perspective, etc. that's happening to that plane over time. Now, what we want to do is we want to make sure that this particular plane, right, instead of being only constrained to the corners of that shape that we initially created, we're going to click on this button here, display the planar surface. Actually, we don't need to do that. We can just take the points that we see here, and we can drag them to the corner of our image like so. Essentially, we want to make sure that the planar tracker surface is not just constrained just to this area here. We can drag all the four corners of that source shape to the four corners of our image. In doing that, we can also precisely line up these points by clicking on this little square icon, Set Image Size Planar Surface. So what happens to this? The image, which started at 1461, eventually tracks. It changes shapes, changes scale as well over time. And that's okay, because what we want to do now at 1461 is create a shape. We can create a roto shape, a new one, and we can call it top wall EMAT. We go to 1461. So the idea here is that we are going to create a very soft shape We're going to blur it eventually and create an ellipse somewhere around here. In fact, let's do this around an area where we know that we have a bit of an issue here. So I'm going to view my final result here. And we know that the smoke at some point goes over this guy here. And we also know that we have another one, another issue on the next two little staircasey looking shapes here on top of the wall. All right, so let's do this for the first one. We're going to test this proof of concept here to see if the idea that I have of tracking the distortion, if that works, then we'll transfer this across to the other guys over there. But in order for this shape to move the same way as the plate, we're going to apply the planar tracker to that shape. And the way to do that is we reopen our planar tracker, and then we select what we want to get from it. So we want to create a corner pin absolute baked. Connect that to my top wall GMAT. What happens over time is that this shape is going to travel and follow the building very precisely. That's exactly what we wanted. So we've applied the planar tracking data to a static non-keyframed garbage mat. So now we're going to use this shape, this tracked garbage mat. Let's take a look at it again. Yeah, so it's a pretty simplistic shape, just moving around. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Perfect. And now we're going to copy. Why don't we leave this here? We'll just make a copy of that. Copy that. And we're going to navigate down to where we have the distortion liquefy step here. So we'll paste this right next to that. Okay. So this shape right now is pretty sharp. I think we're going to need to blur this to make a very soft local distortion. So we are going to blur this with a P, something like, for now, we'll just leave it at this around 40 pixels. Perfect. Now, the paint strokes that we had painted earlier, they are obviously not working. So we will deactivate that, select the node and D, and we're going to take a look at the liquefy result again. So we'll go to a frame. Actually, not the liquefy result, but the effect of the liquefy on top of everything else. So we'll go to a frame where we know for sure that we have some issues. So we can go to the same frame, 1461 here. Is that a frame where we see the problem? Probably not. We got to go further down in time. Okay, so we have two problems here. We have an issue right on around this corner here, and also around this bit of the building here. So because our shape was created to mostly focus on this particular part of the building, so we're going to try to use this particular shape to affect the UV map. You see, this is the UV map that we used earlier to create a distortion on it, and then that distortion is transferred to our image. So what we want to do is to distort the map, but in a different way than with the paint strokes. So let's take a look again at the result here. Instead of doing a transform or a paint stroke, we'll use this shape and we'll try to use another process. We want to shrink or expand the pixels that exist inside of this gradient. So we'll use an erode filter, and we'll use our several erode filters. We'll use the one that is called erode filter. Inside of that, we can choose the kind of filter that we want. We'll use the Gaussian filter. And in the mask input of this node, we're going to connect our tracked shape here. And let's double click on this filter erode here and see what it actually does. So I'll view the results here. So this filter erode, as I mentioned, will shrink or expand the pixels inside of the tracked mask, a garbage mat that we have here. So I'm going to overdo it to see really what kind of effect it has on the results. So I'll type a value of, say, for example, 30. Well, it doesn't really do much. Let's take a look at what's happening here. This shape is fairly soft. This erosion filter is also active, 30 pixels. We are using the mask input, the RGB of the mask input. Yes, that's correct. So, but when we look at the result, not much is happening. So what I'm going to do is turn off that blur for a second. And whether I turn it off or on, nothing really happens. If I turn on the filter erode here, on and off, nothing happens. Well, it's pretty clear as to why nothing happens. It's because in the filter erode, we want to act upon the RGB. So right now, the channels that are being affected Well, it's set to none. However, if we set this to RGB, I would like you to pay attention to what's happening here. So as we are eroding the pixels, we introduce a shift in their original position in the UV map. And this, in effect, translates as, well, a translation in our image. And the value that we have here, 30, is actually making things look worse. Well, if we can make things look worse by having a positive value of 30, what happens if I type a value of minus 30? 30 pixels in both X and Y. I'm going to open up this parameter here. In width, instead of having a minus 30 value, I'm going to push this to 30. And in height, I'm going to bring it down by 30 pixels in terms of erosion. So if you take a quick look here, we actually have solved the issue by simply eroding the values, and we can move this around. We can change the values until we get really a nice read around the edges here. And with a value of about 49, 45 pixels and minus 30 in height and 45 in width, if I turn off this filter erode on and off, well, we've introduced a localized warping just in the area, the problematic area, using a shape. So the proof of concept works for that. Now, what will we need to do for the second one here? Well, it's pretty simple. We would basically duplicate that shape or that little node assembly here. So we'll take this, copy, paste, okay? This time, the single keyframe shape that we have inside of this, instead of having it here, so let's go back again to 1461, where we had this shape be around this part of the wall. We'll take that shape, because we already have a keyframe at 1461, we'll take that same shape, select all, Control A, we'll just make it a little bit smaller, and this time we're going to move it into right around the corner right there. And because we're making this shape a little bit smaller than what it was before, we'll also reduce the amount of blur by, say, 30 pixels instead of 40. And this time, we're going to create another filter erode. So we can copy paste the same one. And this time we'll connect it to the second mask here. Okay, so we'll need to change the values in the second filter erode here, obviously. But let's take a look at the problem area around the corner this time. So now if I go to this frame, 1473, for example, where we do have a bit of that issue, then I can really try to change the erode values in my second erode until I get the edges to sit exactly where I want them to be. So let's change the value minus 30, maybe you go a little bit more, right around there, 45, maybe about here. And what you'll notice is that it's not going to be absolutely perfect. But the idea here is to try to get the edges to sit as closely as possible to the building, the edges inside of our smoke, the holdout from the proxy geo that is baked into our render. We want to bring this a little bit closer to the edge of the real building as much as we can. We will use another trick here to bring things, to kind of finesse things a little bit. So let me make sure that this is sitting kind of where I want it. So middle. So we have roughly the same values in both fields here. And that same shape that I'm using here, in order to help things, I'm just going to select all these nodes and move them down for clarity. Okay. So that same second bit of nodes here, the second shape that we have, we're going to use this shape this time to perform some kind of change on the smoke. So if we take a look higher up in the stack here, this is the smoke. We want to do something to this area to soften, if you like, the sort of blockiness that we see here before it gets warped further down here. Okay, so let's view again the result. This time, I'm going to introduce another step in between here. I'll put a blur and a grade right there. And I will connect this to my previous stack right under the wall roto. And I will also connect the rest of it to that. So essentially, I'm inserting these two nodes here. And let me just create a dot here. And I'll connect the mask input of both of these nodes to this dot around, just to keep things a little bit clean. So I'm moving this around like this, create a connection. Okay, and my backdrop's looking kind of all over the place, so I'm going to control click on the backdrop, click and drag, control click and drag, and I'll just modify the size of my backdrop here just to keep things very clean and organized as always. So let's move these nodes back into some kind of 90 degree angle here to make things very nice and tidy. And I'll bring this back in here. Okay. So what am I going to do here with this shape? So I have this garbage mat here, very soft shape, and I have some really sharp edges here inside of my render. So what I want to do is blur this a little bit and grade the alpha channel of that. So in the grade node, I want to change this to alpha. I want to make sure that I white clamp. And the blur here is going to be set to RGBA, which is what I want. So let's take a look again at the final result. So I'm going to blur inside of this area here, kind of soften everything to a certain extent. As you can see, when I blur this, it immediately kind of softens the issue that we had. And I'm going to change the density of my alpha using a gamma inside of that, just to give it a little more thickness right around the problem area. And just by doing this and doing a little bit of distortion here in the second step inside of my liquify block of nodes here, gotten rid of the issue that we had visible along the edges of the building. So we may inspect a little bit more the other edges, and I notice right here that we have the same really sharp edge. We can use that same shape that we use for this part of the wall this time to create. We can create the same thing again here. We can do a blur. In fact, to be honest, we can just combine this shape, which is the corner one, with the other shape, which is the one next to the corner one. If we were to combine both of those and use them to blur and color grade our alpha here, we'll get more of a subdued density in this area. So we can try to do that again just with this shape, or we can combine them both together. But I feel that maybe we want to have separate control for the corner here and a different kind of control here for this one. So we'll add another blur and grade right underneath this. So B on the keyboard, G on the keyboard, blur and grade. And this time the blur and grade here, let's connect it to another dot. The mask inputs go inside of that dot right here. And as I'm doing this, I mentioned this earlier, I keep saving my script, Control S, it's muscle memory for me. I will continue to do this, and I encourage you to use the same habit, keep saving your script, but while I'm at it, I'm going to version up. And for this, save new comp version, Alt-Shift-S, so I'll do this on my keyboard, Alt-Shift-S, and you'll see that version 2 is going to turn to version 3. Now, I want to connect this step here to this node, the first garbage mat that we did. So it's looking a little bit messy once again. So I'll move things around just to keep things neat and tidy. Move this around here, and I'm going to add a dot. Another way to create a dot is to simply click somewhere and hit the dot on your keyboard. So creating a dot right here. And I'm going to take this connection and connect it to the dot right there. This way, everything stays very, very organized. And there, this time, I am going to change my grade node here, this new grade node that we created, making sure that it's acting on the alpha, white clamp. And this blur here is going to be left to default. So this time, if we look at this particular corner here, we want to soften this a little bit. Not so much, because it's going to start introducing a bit of a halo around that area. But we soften it a little bit, and then in here, in the gamma, we can give a little bit more density to our smoke just in this area, just to get rid of any potential issue that we see around the corner there. So just by doing that, we're combining both a warping operation with a image processing operation using the same shape, using the tracking data from the planar tracker. And technically now, we should not have any of this issue that we're seeing earlier in the previous version. First of all, we kind of turned off. Let me take a look at the render that we had. Yep, this one here. We had some kind of warping happening here, but it was sort of being warping inside of the warping. It was kind of creating a wavy transformation here. So technically now, if I wanted to render this, I could see that it looks better. I'm still noticing a bit of a soft halo around this bit here. So we may have blurred this a little bit too much. So let's see what happens if we reduce the blur. makes it a little bit better. And in the grade alpha for the first one, let's see by, if I can, yeah, just a little bit more, and reducing the blur actually fixes the issue even better. All right, so let's render this again. So now that we are at version 3 in our script, we want to make sure that our right node is also matching the script name. This way we know for sure which script created the final output, and we can easily track things. So here I will select my right node, Alt up arrow on the keyboard, and we'll see that this now is changed to version 3. So let's render this. Select the node, press enter on your keyboard, and we hit the render button again. And this time, Nuke will create a new directory called version 3, and inside of which the final rendered frames will go in, and we'll be able to look at what the final result looks like again in a few minutes. Let's take a look at the final render here. Just always, it's always good to check that nothing is amiss. Sometimes it's difficult, or it's quite easy to overlook certain issues that we may have in our code as we put everything together. And let's inspect everything here. So we have made some fixes on top of the wall where the smoke was interacting or interleaving, or penetrating the wall and leaving the edges. So this is looking pretty good. And then let's take a look at the shadow pass here, because I suspect that I forgot to stencil the shadow pass for the helicopter with the wall the wall roto beside here. And we can see the shadow actually creeping in and covering that wall. So we should take a look at that, make a final little tech fix right there. And if we go towards the top of our node tree here, the shadow pass indeed is not occluded or stenciled by that roto. So we'll just add 2 nodes here. We'll add a merge node, and we'll make sure that the B input is the main one here, going into the merge node. We'll set this to stencil. Set bounding box to B as our main input here. And we will take a look at wall roto here, which is coming from this part of the tree. So we'll add another dot right here. We'll connect that dot to the wall roto, and we'll also connect the other side of the merge node to that dot. So I'll just do this right there, connecting that, and technically we should have a bit of a fix in place here, which would prevent our shadow from going on top of that wall. So let's find a frame where the wall appears, and we see it right there. We see that the roto of the wall, if we turn that off and on, that's exactly what we wanted. And we have prevented that shadow from creeping on top of the wall. And at this stage, we may need to re-render again to get a proper result. So let's compare the previous render that we had with a shadow going there, and to figure out where we might have gone wrong here. So I'll go back all the way up to the shadow pass, and also all the way to actually the A over B, basically the helicopter here, which is very much at the very end of our tree here. So whatever element that, or whatever nodes that we added here, we're going to try to turn them off and see mostly the blurring, the ground shadow here, the blurring of it. What happens if we turn that off? You can see the problem comes from the fact that we've blurred the ground shadow pass maybe a little bit too much. Okay, so let's inspect what this blur does to the pass itself. Let's take a look at the result here. So yeah, we had something that was fairly crunchy. We've blurred it. Now, looking at the result here, the result of that being blurred is better. However, it's creating that issue. So we have several ways of tackling that. We can keep the blur overall where we want it to be, but we can also prevent the blur from being applied in the area here of problem. So we can use a garbage matte to say, we are blurring everything else but here. Well, that might work, but that means that we'll need to go and create a garbage matte and follow this particular part of the shadow pass right here. So the other way we can try to fix that is, if we look at after the blur, if we're to put a grade node here, we'll white clamp this. We definitely don't need this value to go over 1, so we'll clamp it at 1 because we are only using the luminance value of this to create our shadow. So we'll go here and we'll see if there's anything we can do with a grade node to try to prevent the formation of that edge here. So we can try gammaing up or down, and a simple gamma fix right there seems to be doing the trick. As you can see here, if I turn that off, if I turn the grade node off, it's actually revealing that edge. And if I turn it on, it's kind of going away a little bit. Though I'm still noticing a little bit of something around the helicopter here. Let's see what else we can do to try to finish this and get rid of this problem. Let's take a look at the blur value again. What happens if we reduce that blur value to about half value that we see here? 5 divided by 2 gives us 2.5. And we can see that it's actually improving things somewhat for additional passes there. In fact, we know for sure that there's some kind of an edge right around there. So we're going to continue downstream to see if possibly the issue is maybe with this pass here. So the reason I'm doing it that way, going step by step, is to give you an idea of like how to diagnose problems and figuring out in logical manner where the issue might be. So we go step by step, group by group, to figure out where we might have left something in there. We might have something to fix in one of the blocks of nodes, but we won't really know for sure until we actually take the time to debug and going from block to block, figuring out what the issue might be. So let's turn off the lens distortion here. So the lens distortion is not really fixing the issue either. The RPG itself is only visible for 2 frames, so it cannot be there either. So let's take a look at this render pass, explosion, debris, fire, smoke. And what happens if I turn it off? Well, it's not there either. So it must be somewhere else. And if that's the case, we need to take a look at how all the nodes are when they are combined together. So we'll take a look at this here. And here we don't really see any of the white edge. We see the helicopter, the smoke. Now let's take a look at the alpha channel here. And there we have it. We see something inside of the alpha channel which leaves a little bit of transparency here, right around the helicopter. And that might be what our issue is, because if this alpha channel is not solid, what we are perceiving as a whitish or more visible edge around the helicopter is essentially the plate back there. We're seeing through to the plate right there. And it is that visibility, that transparency, that's creating the illusion of an edge being white. So there are multiple ways we can potentially address that. And one of the ways that I'm thinking we can hide this issue would be to use the alpha channel of our helicopter, just the helicopter all by itself, as you see here. And using this alpha value here, we can try to color correct the plate from behind the helicopter and see if that's going to help a bit. So we can try. I'm not saying this is going to be the final solution, but if we try, we'll see if that fixes the problem just in this area. So here I'm just adding a grade node, and I will use the alpha of the helicopter. You can just take this output here, a dot. So this is our heli exploded or exploding helicopter. And we'll use this as a mask for our grading node that's going to be applied to the plate. Okay, so remember we also applied the lens distortion further down before we put the whole helicopter and smoke and everything together here. If that is the case, then we should apply the same lens distortion. I'll select that backdrop, copy, paste. We'll apply the same lens distortion to the rest of the helicopter, which is now all by itself. So we'll apply this right there. And the source will be this, and the output will be that. So let's rearrange this to keep it clean. And let's see what we can do here with the matte of the helicopter to try to fix this potential white edge that we see here. So I'm just going to try it might not work, but I'm curious to see what happens if we grade down the plate using the alpha value of the helicopter. So you can see that this is partially fixing or almost entirely fixing the issue around the base of the helicopter here, but this is also affecting other edges around the tail of the helicopter. So we got to be careful about not creating something or fixing something, but creating another problem somewhere else. So let's see if that is helping even more if we were to take only the section of the helicopter that has the issue, so namely just around here. Take a look at some additional frames later on. In fact, check that. I will look at the render itself, the previous render that I did, and I will go and inspect where really the issue is happening and what block of frames, what frame numbers. So we start seeing the issue at frame 1459 to about frame. So let's keep going. Maybe we keep seeing it for longer. Maybe we see it all the way to the end. So from around 1457, 1460, that's when we first start seeing the edge around the helicopter. So what we'll do, something quite simple, I'm going to use a garbage mat just around this area here, something very simple like that. And we'll go to the very last frame. We'll take that shape, Control A, we'll rotate it a little bit, just kind of keeping it right around there. Right, so all of the bottom of the body of the helicopter is obviously below or behind the smoke and dust. That's okay. We'll just reduce the size of our shape. And it doesn't really matter if this shape is kind of um, connecting or intersecting with the wall, because we can then use the roto of the wall to cut that off. And let's go in the middle here between the two keyframes. So we'll take this shape, reposition it, move it somewhere here. Again, keeping the base of the helicopter in the middle of that garbage mat. We can take these 2 points here, bring them in. Don't need that to be so wide, so big. Okay. And let's go between the two first keyframes here. And again, we'll move that, rotate that, reposition that shape. And we'll go again between the last two keyframes here, just making sure that we are positioned correctly. As you can see, the way I'm creating the keyframes here, I started from the very beginning, going to the end, and then dividing that space more and more and more, and inspecting that the keyframes between are where I want them to be. So if I go between the first two keyframes here, this needs further adjustment right there. Okay, so we have a shape that is more or less following the body of the helicopter. And I want to make sure that for the first keyframe here, when we see it, we see the helicopter, this particular frame doesn't have any issue. So the problem really starts at frame 1460. So what I'll do, very simply, this particular shape here, we have two options. We can take that shape, and at frame 1059, we can move it out of the area, or we can also, in here in the roto node, if we go to the very last tab, the node tab, by clicking on here, we can keyframe the disable, or I have the disable switch animated. So before at frame 1460, we want it to be active, so not disabled. And the frame before, we want to disable it. So this way, even if the shape is still in the viewer, it only becomes active at 1460. And you can see when it's not active, it has a single diagonal line going through the node. That means that the disabling of that node is not constant, it is animated. That's why you have a single line. Okay, so we have this, we can name this roto or this garbage mat bottom of helicopter. Okay, so that is the bottom of a helicopter here. And we're going to use this shape. Remember, we did the issue we were having in here was visible at the very bottom here. So this particular shape, we'll use it to only affect the problem areas where we have the edge visible on at the bottom of the helicopter. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so here's our bottom helicopter uh, garbage matte here. Just throw some blur on it. B for blur. Let's just blur this 30 pixels, should be enough. And we know that the issue is happening really in the alpha channel here. So I'm going to use this shape here to try to reduce or increase the density of the alpha channel just in this area there. And in fact, we can even do this either on the helicopter and here or on the entire thing here. Well, I don't necessarily want to affect this entire alpha channel, which includes other elements which don't have an issue. So I will make the change right here. I'll put a grade node right here, and I will connect that to my garbage matte right there. And what I'll be changing is really just the alpha channel. So I'll set the channels inside of this grade node to alpha, white clamp. And while viewing the result on the problematic frame here at 1460, I'm going to start playing around gently, very gently, to on the alpha channel using a garbage matte right there to be able to see if changing those values in there are going to improve the edge in the problematic areas here on this particular frame. So there are two things we can play around with. The gamma is one thing. So what happens if I go up? So it's actually changing a little bit of the gamma, but not to the extent that it's getting rid of the black or the white edge at the bottom here. So instead, I'm going to take the white point and reduce that and see if it has any effect. It does have some effect, but we have to be careful not to overdo it to the point where we're introducing the inverse of the issue we're trying to fix, which is creating a black edge. So I'm lowering this to about 0.8, and I'm going to play around with the gamma slightly, something like that, more or less, just around there. I might even increase the blur a little bit on that shape just to make sure that we're not making that area too concentrated. And let's double check. Yep, our shape really encompasses the entire helicopter here. And that's perfect. And let's go again, play around with those values. And we seem to have reduced the issue that we were having before. And just by altering the density of the alpha channel right there, it seems to have fixed the issue. So now that we've made this change, we can either re-render the entire sequence, or because we've rendered only the frames, because we have rendered as a file sequence, we can only render the frames where the issue was. And we know that we have a frame range for this because we have the very first, actually, we'll need to fix that too, but we had, you know that the very first frame where the alpha channel of this shape is active is 1460. And we can re-render the frames 1460 to 1500, overriding the existing frames because we know that these are the frames that had the issue. And you will have noticed that because I animated the deactivation of the garbage matte here, because this node expects an RGB.alpha as a mask, well, it's throwing an error because this node no longer generates any alpha because we've deactivated it. So instead of that, instead of doing the deactivation the way that I've done it, I'm going to go back into the node here and right click on the disable and select no animation. So I'm going to leave this enabled, but at frame, so if our first frame here is, first active frame is 1460, at 1459, I'm going to take this shape and move it out of the way. Okay, so now when we look at the grade 21, it no longer throws an error because even though the shape is outside of the screen area, it still generates an alpha channel. The alpha channel is not non-existent. It is still there. It just happens to be black. Therefore, we're not getting this error message. Okay. So now that we have that, we're going to re-render the frames for 1460 until the end. And for good measure, I'll actually start at 1459. All right, I'll select my render again, my right node, and I'll render again from 1460 or 1459. all the way to 1500. So that's just over 40 frames. That should be a fairly quick render. So we'll let that finish. And again, we will reload our final result and do a final sort of like check, making sure that everything is to our liking.